But there was a profound conversation that you had with John Vervaeke, and I'm not sure if you remember this. It was probably like a year ago, and there was a point in the conversation that really struck me, and I just want to go back to it, and maybe you'll be able to remember it. So I'm just going to kind of, say what you guys were saying, what you guys were talking about, and see what comes up for you. But in this part of the conversation, you say words that I'm using, they're terms of the typology of a kind of hyper mathematics, right at it's a conceptual mathematics. And then John says, you're trying to get to, a grounding relationship between ethics and ontology. I appreciate that. And I think that in itself is fundamental. You say, can I say something that might sound incredibly egotistic? Yes, I'm not looking for it. I found it. I know for a fact it's done. It's like, it's intense. It's really intense, but it emerges a lot of really beautiful stuff. And you go on to say, and to make this specific claim was because you talked about it as a relationship between ethics and ontology. I'm basically saying it's not just a relationship between ethics and ontology. John says, how would you characterize it then? You say it's a relationship between ethics, ontology, and epistemology. In other words, it's a structure that is at once all of these things and none of them, in the sense that it is a deeper basis from which all three emerge. So in effect, when I say I know something, I'm not making an opinion. I'm basically saying this because the nature of epistemology itself is wrapped into the nature of ethics and ontology directly. So my understanding of this is that through developing your metaphysics, you've discovered some kind of fundamental order that lies behind reality. May I say it's as if you discovered God. If you remember this conversation,
I remember that part very specifically.
Yeah, when you were saying that, to me, that was almost like a climax, because I felt your energy and your passion and your conviction. So I'm wondering, like, what have you discovered and how has this understanding transformed you?
The what part is the axioms and the modalities, and how it's transformed me. Wow. I don't know if there's any part of my, I like, there's a sort of irony in that question. And part of it is that, like, when we're looking at the relationship between the subjective and the objective, right? The relationship as a kind of interaction, as a perception. So I can talk about perceiver, perceived, and perceiving. At first, these are held as if they are concepts, as if they're ideas. And instead of calling it metaphysics, I could have called it, meta concepts, or meta causation, or meta causation is not quite right, but meta conceptual. And that there's a sense in which, at first, we experience the metaphysics, the axioms and the modalities, as if they're abstractions. We have these triples, and there's all sorts of them, and they all connect together, and we can sort of use the understanding of one triple in one domain to better understand that another triple in another domain, and the axioms sort of characterize those patterns and so on. But at a certain point, you come to notice it's challenging to speak of, but you come to notice that you can't regard the concepts of the subjective and the objective. It's your subjective and the now objective. And that the relationship of perception as a process is basically that all is process. There is no such thing as there's no such thing as a thing. That all is process, and that the process itself is essentially characterized by axiom 2. That our thinking about it is essentially characterized by axiom 1. And that the transfusiveness of it, the sense in which it is at the ground of all things, is the axiom 3 concept, the very notion of triple itself, foundational triplication happening. And so in this sense, these are no longer abstractions. You discover them to be very, very real in the very, very notion of your experience of the here and now in its most primal sense. Right? The concept of process as being connecting doing and becoming. Right? The being is more fundamental than doing and becoming, but we can think about and talk about doing. It's observable. In the same sort of sense that that which we perceive is observable, but the perceiver and the perceiving, not observable. So I can't perceive the perceiving and I can't perceive the perceiver. So of the totality of what is, only 1/3 of which is discussable, is pointable, is objective enough to be constructed into forms and shapes, and therefore the content of dialogue. You know, in effect, it's like I remember one time I was approaching Bowdoin College Library in Maine, and I was really enthusiastic about, you know, doing some research and looking at that, and then I had this thought. It was like, but the only things I can study in the library is the kind of stuff that can be written down in books. And that maybe there's a certain kind of knowing, a certain kind of knowledge that just doesn't have enough structure. It just isn't about structure. So therefore it can't be written down in books. It just can't be described in language at all. And without trying to get all mystical or seem all, you know, kind of spiritual about it or ephemeral or anything, it's just that it turns out that there are some kinds of things that are very, in the very nature of the process. I'm reminded of Descartes. So his program was, you know, he's basically in prison wanting something to do. And so being a philosophical character, he basically said, all right, I'm gonna do this exercise. This exercise is I'm going to take as true only those things about which I have no doubts. And I'm going to be really broad about what it means to have a doubt. I'm going to basically say, if I can have any doubt about it, even conceptually, I'm going to take it as potentially not true and therefore not true for the purposes of trying to find out those things about which I can have no doubts, about which it's impossible to have doubt. And so, you know, that was his method for trying to identify capital T truth, those things which are not able to be doubted, therefore must be true in some sort of non-contingent sense. And you know, this program is kind of an interesting program. It's great that somebody did this, right? So in a sense, you know, he goes through this meditation. It takes him a few years, and he arrives at this thing. I think, therefore I am. I.e., that the process of thinking and the process of being have become the same. That any interruption of one is the interruption of the other. And so, in this sense, the notion of the most elemental sense of I perceive is the most elemental sense of I am. Right? And you know, this is a great thing. You know, a lot of people have gotten really into this and thought that this was it. You know, this is quote unquote the subjective capital T truth. And it's interesting. He actually missed a whole other category. Anything which is intrinsic to the nature of doubt can't be doubted. Right? He was trying to basically use doubt as a tool, but the tool itself has a process. It is a process, right? I'm going to check. Can I doubt something? And you know, doubt as a process has intrinsics. Comparison has intrinsics. It has characteristics that are essential as part and parcel of that concept. You can't have that concept without these other concepts sort of being dragged along, right? And so, in this sense, the intrinsics of doubt can't be doubted, because if I attempted to doubt them, I'd be instantiating them. I.e., if I was to have doubt about doubt, I would have taken doubt with me in the process of having doubt. And the things I can't take with me, I can't doubt, because they're always going to be there in the very action of having doubt in itself. So therefore, they can't be doubted. Right? Neat little trick, that. So when we sort of notice this, we can basically say, well, what are the intrinsics of doubt, right? Like, those things must be pretty important. And it turns out that they are the same kinds of things that were identified in I Think, Therefore I Am, which is part of the reason why these things are recognizable as being profound. So in that sense, you know, I can't hold that the notion of perception and the notion of identity are distinct. Right? I have to treat them as essentially aligned concepts. And I also have to recognize, given the reality of what can be perceived, right? The perceived is perceivable, but the perception and the perceiver aren't, that I now have to make explicit adjustments to my conceptual process to account for those things as being real, even though they are not visible. They are aspects of the process of visioning, of seeing. And so in this specific sense, when we start to make corrections and really start to take in these ideas and work with them with, you know, at this particular point, some degree of carefulness, right? Some degree of of real discernment and real discipline, that we can begin to notice that, these aren't just concepts. They are things that are living in the very perception of the perceptions I'm having right now, that I cannot not see them. I cannot see with them. So it's not the abstract notion of being, it is the actual notion of being. And it's not the abstract notion of how do I know, it's the process of knowing itself. And in the sense that there's a sense of connectedness in that, and a wanting to maintain integrity around the process of perception that is emerging out of that process, not some sort of integrity from the outside in, but from the inside out, that I can't not have care. It can't not matter. It can't not be meaningful. The notion of meaningfulness, the notion of knowing, the notion of being are all the same. And so in this sense, there's sort of a kind of capitulation of what is the topic of metaphysics. In one sense, I describe it as the relationship between the subjective and the objective, and an inquiry into the very nature of that relationship, which of course is what we're realizing. But also the deep questions like, what is, how do we know, and why should we care? Because we do care, and we do know, and we are, right? And so in this sense, there's a sort of fundamentalness that emerges in the characterization of the axioms and the modalities that is not, it's not contingent on something other than itself. The axioms and the modalities can and do describe themselves. And this, of course, has been treated as a mark of a really good metaphysics, or a really good body of mathematics, is that it can be self-describing. And this has been known mostly to, deep practitioners, i.e. maybe, a dozen or so people in the world at any given moment. But the idea is that not only is that the case, that it can be describing of itself, because it's about process. Right? There's something really unique in the sense that in being about process, the axioms and modalities is being a description of process, that it's not only the case that it describes itself, it describes the process of describing itself. And this is a whole other order. It's like it changes the nature of what it means to understand. It changes the nature of what it means to be, and how we know what we are to care about. So in that sense, I've experienced that feeling, that thinking, that sense directly, right? There's no moment in which I can have doubt about it, because the very process, as in the same sense I was connecting earlier, of trying to question it effectively instantiates it. Like it's like at this particular point, being in possession of these tools, the tools themselves as being the very same tools of logic and of reason, and deeper than that, right? They are the tools that uphold the very basis of what we mean to be logical or reasonable. Like the idea itself of knowing is in a sense upheld by these things. So in effect, what ends up happening is that whatever method you're using, in empiricism in the sense of firsthand experience, or logic and reason as a sort of analytic approach, or some sort of mysticism, that the result either way ends up being undeniable. And that continually happens. Like it's like first person all the time. And so in that specific sense, I mean, on one hand, it's like everything is exactly the way it has always been. There's, it's like, before and after, exactly the same experiences, except that the way in which we're holding those experiences has been completely changed. The context of how I bring myself into my self life is not at all the same. So there's nothing that you can point to, but the experience of life has become quite surreal. It becomes actually quite difficult to convey, and the kinds of things which we would normally think of, like I can knock on the wall, for example, and so on and so forth, and people think that that's solid, and that it has, that it's quite concrete, and that it can be discussed quite easily, and that things like metaphysics are very ephemeral and very hard to talk about. Spiritual concepts are quite difficult to speak on. My experience is the exact inverse of this. the things which were once described as completely ephemeral to me feel extremely concrete, like way easier to hold and to be held by. And things which we would normally treat as objects or events or stuff that ordinarily would think to be quite concrete becomes to me very ephemeral. So there's this sense of liminality that results, and yeah, in that sense, I have definitely been changed. If I had somehow constructed a time machine and went back in time and told myself then what I now know to be the case, I would be. It's so incredible. It's so beyond my wildest expectations of anything I could hope to have achieved. The younger self that was making a vow to be in devotion to larger causes of life and ecosystem and so on, of the wildness of nature, would not have anticipated that the willingness to be transformed, to accept whatever it would take to get to an understanding or a sort of knowing. I was intensely curious, and the devotion is real. And so in effect, there's a sense in which one is willing to do whatever it takes to be and to become whatever it takes. And that only in the totality of that commitment does that transformation actually happen.